Welcome to What's Your Point with Colin Barnes and Graham Mills. In this series of podcasts, we will use a famous statement or quote from the world of sport to start our conversation and bring light to a topic. Our goal is to dispel myths and make the truth stick. Come join us in the discussion. This week's quote comes from the famous Hansen comment on Manchester United's performance against Aston Villa in 1995 on Match of the Day. You can't win anything with kids. Take a listen.
I think they've got problems. I wouldn't say they've got major problems. Obviously, 3 players have departed. The trick is always buy when you're strong. So he needs to buy players. You can't win anything with kids. You look at that line at Manchester United today, and Aston Villa at 2:15 when they get the team sheet, it's just going to give them a lift, and it'll happen every time he plays the kids. He's got to buy players, as simple as that.
But they have, as he
Okay, hi Colin. We're here today to talk about a statement that Hansen, Match of the Day pundit, said 25 years ago now. So in 95, Manchester United lost their first game of the season to Aston Villa 3-1, and he made what is now quite a famous statement that you can't win anything with kids. So with the game having changed massively over that 25-year period, we're here today to discuss, is that statement true? Is that statement more relevant today than it was back then? Obviously Manchester United went on to win the league that season with a team of youthful players from their academy. So we're just here to discuss whether that is now probably more true today with the money that's involved in football, that academy players perhaps aren't getting the chance at the super clubs, the top elite clubs nowadays.
Yeah, it's a great comment to discuss, and especially with the likes of Barcelona and all the fiasco of Messi and whether he should stay or not, and kind of the decline of the academy system at Barcelona. And I find it really interesting when we talked about this, is in context. I was 15 at that time. In 95, you were 10? So
11, yeah.
We were very young and not as understandable, but going through it in the spring and going into that summer of 95, one of the best sides that I remember growing up was the Ajax team.
Yeah, of course.
And they had 8 of the 11 that started and won against AC Milan were their own academy players. And the game winner, the match winner, came off the bench, Kluivert, so he was the 9th academy player. And they were a bunch of kids. Now, obviously, there were some veterans in there, but so he's saying that context, obviously, speaking specifically to the United group and that class of 92. But it's interesting to see how those times have kind of evolved and changed and gone through.
Well, I guess the landscape, if we go back, 98 was the Charter for Quality, so that's when academies or Centre of Excellences were installed, and then since then we've seen the EPPP now. So we've also seen some success in England with the under-17s and the under-21s World Cup wins. So the landscape of football has changed a huge amount, and then if you add to that the income now that's there from broadcasting rights, I don't know if it's as comparable or as relevant to how it was back then, because the landscape has changed a lot. You mentioned the class of 92 there, so in that Aston Villa team the team that played against Aston Villa that day, there was Phil Neville, Gary Neville, Nicky Butt, Paul Scholes, Beckham and John O'Kane. So 6 players in that team, and obviously around that you had the likes of Roy Keane, Paul Pallister, Schmeichel, I think Cantona. So I don't know if it's possible for a team to be able to stitch or knit together academy prospects at that level. So 6 there. We see sometimes now with 1 or 2, but 6 academy players. I think you mentioned Ajax there with, was it 8?
8. Yeah.
So can they coexist in the same team and have success at the super club level? So we're talking, Premier Leagues, Champions Leagues, or is it a case of you go for one or the other? Do you go for potential and then hopefully sell them on, but with that comes the fact that you may become a selling club and therefore might not be as successful? Or do you go for short-term success and bring in established international players that can perhaps bring you into that sort of environment with the super clubs?
Yeah, it seems like the necessary evil of, in order to stay on top, you need to buy, and regardless of how you've done in the previous year, you don't appear to be moving forward if you're not buying players. And Liverpool is an example of that this year. That they've obviously had their best year in many, and even though it's a young side, and they've proven how incredibly good and dominant they've been, they still need to portray that, and it's come at the expense of maybe some of their youth, which I know we'll get into. But this idea that you have to be a Galacticos, you have to be a Real Madrid, and always acquiring the best talent, and the Mourinhos of the world don't allow for the youth to come through and to be given opportunities is quite a contrast to the Busby Babes and Sir Alex, that would make sure that the academy players not only were given opportunities, but they weren't given opportunities in a failing setting. So you read the books in his autobiography. He's always making sure that people are insulated. So you're never putting too many people that are unsure next to each other. You put the Dennis Irwins, the Steve Bruce, the Gary Pallisters next to a Gary or a Phil Neville to make sure that their experiences is a good one, not only for them individually but also as the team. And that, as you talked about, that potential, like how do you give playing minutes without sacrificing possible wins?
Yeah, and I guess because of the amount of money and the interest in football now from sponsors, endorsements, broadcasting rights, Alan Hansen's statement, if we rewind back to 95, that was the first game of the season. Now we're in an environment where that first game of the season, we've got examples, and he played in the game for Ajax. De Boer, we've seen him have 4 games at Crystal Palace and be sacked. So back in 95, the pressure might not have been quite as intense, so Alex Ferguson was able to have time with those players to get the senior pros around these young talented academy graduates. Nowadays, perhaps managers don't have the time to do that. Maybe 1 or 2 games with a defeat, and pundits are saying you can't win anything with kids. Maybe that's enough to force a CEO or an owner to maybe have some second thoughts about that manager, and they perhaps don't get the tenure that they deserve to actually embed a philosophy or bring players into a group. And as we know, success in sport is often long term. It doesn't often happen as a quick fix or a quick win. So maybe the pressure on managers is a factor nowadays that perhaps wasn't as intense back then.
And the illusion right now with that is that the money from the Premier League, obviously from Champions League, is so overwhelming on not only the boards, the owners, and then it trickles down to the coach, the manager, and the players. But one other thing is the parity from top to bottom, and not only the league setup. So the easy wins that might have occurred, we always think back to Solskjaer coming on against Forest and getting a late hat trick, and 8-0 that day, I think it was. Those sort of matches don't happen as often. The amount of money that's not only put into, obviously the top clubs, but everyone's ability level to improve with, whether it's the performance analyst, it's, more specialized coaches and support staff. The quality is, you can't just throw out your second team. We look at United this past week when they go to the Carabao Cup, and they had to bring on their 3 big forwards and midfielders, had to bring on players to win the game because they were struggling so much and should have been scored on. And so those opportunities to play maybe your younger players to get quality minutes. Managers aren't compelled to do it because there's no guarantee that they can actually win that. See how Moyes' tenure at United was never an easy one, and that should have been. So, the stress with the money, and then the actual quality around both leagues, whether within the Premier League or within Champions League, is definitely come together and is more difficult for these managers.
Yeah. There's always been, since the Premier League started in '92, there's always been perhaps a sparsity of homegrown English players in the league. A lot of foreign players play in the Premier League. It's a global brand. It's talked about as being the best league in the world. So there's always been that issue of young English players breaking through. There was a sort of a tide change last season. Obviously, the standout one was Chelsea with their transfer embargo. So, the likes of Tammy Abraham and Mason Mount and Reece James playing minutes in the Premier League. So I think the number of appearances from English players last season was as high as it's been in a long time. Now we've seen Chelsea come out of that transfer embargo, and they've spent approximately 200 million on established international players. So obviously as a case study, it's quite interesting to see how that pans out. Will Chelsea now revert back to that short-term success and breaking into the top four and challenging with Man City and Liverpool, or will Frank Lampard find a way of piecing these players together to make sure that he's got a balance? Probably the early indication is that he's going to go with success now and put these players in the team. So Werner will play as he did do in the first game of the season, and Tammy Abrahams will be on the bench. I think they started with Reece James and Mason Mount that game. So whilst last season was a good season for homegrown talent in the Premier League, that's maybe a one-off, and I suppose it remains to be seen how this season will pan out. Then obviously we've got Liverpool, so winning the Champions League season before last and Premier League for the first time in 30 years. You've got Trent Alexander-Arnold in the team, a young homegrown player, and they are producing players. There's lots of good talent. Nico Williams, Curtis Jones. They bought Harvey Elliott from Fulham, Rhian Brewster, Harry Wilson. Lots of talent in there. But again, if we sort of look at that dig a little bit deeper into that, they've just signed Jota, Thiago, Tsimikas. So 3 established internationals, and out the door have gone Ajaria. I think there's talk about Wilson going for 15 million. A few clubs interested in him. Brewster, again 19 million, perhaps rising to 25. Kia, Jana, whoever, has gone to Wolves. So again, they are producing players, but they're not quite breaking into becoming first team regulars or quite making that next step up. So they're almost makeshift. They develop these players, they get them around the first team, but then there comes a point where they may not be good enough, or the manager or the club might not be as patient to blood them in, and then they make way, so the funds that is generated from selling them then can bring in the likes of Jota, Thiago and Tsimikas. So is the academy there for the development of talent to play for the first team, for the parent club, or is the academy there now for a different reason, as almost a bit of a cash cow to produce money to then sign established internationals?
Yeah, it's every club. I think you mentioned it earlier about do we try and get to that elite level, or do we just go ahead and concede, okay, that we're just going to be a developing club, kind of like Crewe Alexander, and this super club mentality. There's only very few clubs that have reached that top tier in that echelon, And so it's Juventus, it's obviously the Galacticos with Real Madrid, the Barcelonas, Man United's, the PSG, and then obviously Man City. Well, in the past, Chelsea was in that top tier, and they didn't do it by their academy system. They did it from purchasing players, but within the last couple of years, they've obviously dropped out. So I think you're right. I think it's a abnormality and an imposed, we're going to go with academy players rather than this is our club philosophy. So their job is to try and get into that top tier again, because they're not quite there. Yes, they were able to make it to a Europa final, but they really want the Champions League or in the Premier League. Same can be said for Liverpool. They haven't been in. They've just entered into it now with back-to-back Champions League finals, one of them winning, and then this year breaking the hump and getting over with the Premier League. Their job, as you said, is that short term. And so, yes, they want to create those academy players, but there comes a time, kind of like what Barca found out after their 2009 Champions League. There's only 11 players that can play, and once a player is a world-class player and has proven it, and they're young, Alexander Trent-Arnold, he's going to stay there. He's going to be a right back for Liverpool for another decade, hopefully with no injuries. And so that is going to prevent the next right back or wing back that's going to come out of Liverpool's academy. In fact, if I was an academy player that was in their system, I'd make sure that I went and found another avenue. And so and I think it kind of suffocated itself, that Barca team. What did we say? They had 7 academy players in the final in 2009 against United. Add an 8th when Pedro came on. So they're kind of the last remaining academy produced at the world stage out there.
Yeah, and when was 2009? Mm-hmm. So we're now 10 years on. And that's probably the last real example of a club that has won at that stage, whether it's Champions League or whether it be a Premier League or a La Liga or whatever it might be, the top 5 leagues. That probably is the last example of that being done with such a number of homegrown academy products in there. There's obviously, like you said, there's obviously clubs that have self-imposed rules around developing players and putting them in the first team. Obviously Bilbao being probably the classic example of that. And then there are clubs around Europe like Leverkusen, Rennes, Salzburg. Ajax, probably the closest club to this, the super club sort of level. But they're not in one of the top 5 leagues. The Dutch league isn't as strong as the Italian, the Spanish, the English league, and they've not quite got over the line in the Champions League. They came very close, of course, with the result at Tottenham that knocked them out, but they're still not quite there. And then obviously with Ajax, what happens the season afterwards? They get decimated because all the big super clubs that we're talking about can come and take the talent they've produced. So it's an interesting one where it's taken 10 or 11 years for us to really see. There's no club that's doing it now with young academy produced players blended in with senior professionals. And are we ever going to see that again? Because now we're starting to see clubs like Dortmund come up with a model to actually capitalise on all this. So like we said, Liverpool, they've got Nico Williams, Curtis Jones and Harvey Elliott now often warming the bench. They might play in the Carabao Cup, or they might come in the FA Cup, perhaps every now and then make a Premier League appearance. But inevitably those players want to develop, they want to be senior professionals playing week in, week out. And we've seen it with Sancho. At some point Dortmund becomes a really appealing prospect because they can go there, they can play week in, week out. And with Sancho now, I think is worth 100 million.
Yeah, United. What does the paper said? Are going to put in a final bid today of what, 90 million. So, I mean, stupid money. Add in Bellingham. Did the same thing.
So it's not. We're not saying that these clubs aren't producing players. Chelsea are producing players. Liverpool are producing players. Man United, probably one of the best over the years on producing players. They're there, but they're perhaps not getting the opportunity, and that's probably the key word, is the opportunity. And now clubs are becoming savvy and aware of that, and they're starting to pick off these players at younger ages, give them opportunities in the first team, and because of the money that's now involved, a player can be taken for relatively cheaply. So, if Brewster does go for 19 million, a couple of years playing first team football, he may be worth a significant amount more in the future. Now, is that a concern of Liverpool's, or is it the fact that they can sell him and get Thiago in, who has just won the Champions League? He's an outstanding player, one of the best in the world, and then get him for 25. So really, like for like, 25 million for Thiago, 19 million for Brewster. They go with Thiago because more chance of winning the Premier League or the Champions League with him in the squad, rather than being patient and maybe giving Brewster the chance. It's a real fine balance.
Yeah, and the driving force for every manager and every club is going to be different. We want to think that Klopp, coming from Dortmund, having experience in producing young talent, that and obviously he's at kind of the pinnacle of his career, and definitely with the love from all the Reds, that he wouldn't necessarily be coerced into, I'm just going to go for the now. But we don't know the answer behind it, and if that is a completely he's driving it, or is it the full club. It does come with consequences, and the EPPP was created to give these more opportunities, yet EPPP and the money generated for all of the academies within the EPPP is based off of transfers, which is coming in from all of these high value players. So it's actually feeding the money that keeps coming in is actually feeding against what the EPPP is intended for, and producing and giving English homegrown talent out there. So in order for the next Barca to occur, there's got to be spaces and places for it. Chelsea had its opportunity, and yet the allure of playing in Champions League was too overwhelming, even for Frank Lampard. Why wouldn't you want to take Havertz and Timo Werner? They just bought a new goalkeeper because of Kepa, or loaned him in. So that drive is going to be playing, and I think you're right. The clubs are going to have to make a decision. It's not that a club is fixed. Clubs are always trying to be ambitious, but the ones that find their niche and know who they are, are able to develop the players that they're looking for. Saints is a great example from the previous decade, and all the young talent, and obviously many of their great players are now at Liverpool, and we can also add in the Bales of the world, and so that model isn't a bad one. But it might not be for the super clubs, and I think it's going to take maybe it's Barca failing a few times before creating those spaces for the youth to come through, to be given the opportunity, and then it takes someone strong enough to go, you know what, I'm well established enough, like Sir Alex was. Louis van Gaal back in '95, he was established enough. He was in a league in the Dutch Eredivisie that he could play his youngsters, give them those times. As you said, it's not with all the stress and all the competition. It's difficult to provide that. So therefore, it must need someone very strong-willed and good enough to win with kids that Alan Hansen said you couldn't do.
I guess it comes back to the culture and the vision of the club as well, so everyone's got to be on board with it. It can't just be a strong, dominant leader to say this is what we're doing. It's everyone's got to buy into that, and that's maybe why Ajax over years. So we talked about the final in '95, and more recently they got to a semi-final with the Champions League. Now they might not be in that super club bracket, but there's a clear culture that runs through the club and everyone's on board with it. So if you're a manager coming in, you know that you have to bring youth players into the group, and not at the cost of just short-term success. No, they're in, and you have to knit them in with the group.
And who's their technical director again at Ajax right now?
I
think it's Van de Sar.
Van der Sar,
starting keeper in that game.
Yeah, and they're renowned for sort of Bergkamp coming back to the club and ex-players that keep that culture and those living traditions going. And I think the point that you make about sometimes it takes failure and crisis to occur for people to go back to their roots and actually realise that having that balance is key. You look at Man United, they've gone through a period of, from relative to the size of the club, real disappointment. And now, so they've tried bringing in Lukaku, they've tried bringing Ibrahimovic, they've tried bringing in big names, and it's not worked. Sanchez, and now you look at their front line, Greenwood, Rashford.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that was the wake-up call they need, and now they're starting to revert back to that sort of era of the class of '92 and give their own grown players a chance. And maybe that's why Barcelona is so revered, especially with Pep Guardiola and the way they played. But not only the way they played, but the way they did it. To win a Champions League with, was it 8 players in the starting lineup, 7 players in the starting lineup? That's a phenomenal achievement, and so it suggests that it can be done. The established pros, the international professionals, the Galacticos, if you like, can be working in the same team. They can coexist with academy talent, but it takes the right sort of environment, the right culture, the right manager. There's lots more to it. And I don't know if you saw recently, Lampard came out in the press and said we're not an academy club. There was a perception when he came from Derby, because he'd worked with a lot of the players on loan, because he'd worked in the academy prior to going to Derby, that he was going to come in, and whilst they had that embargo, he was going to turn them into this sort of homegrown club where academy players sort of play week in, week out. And he came out in the press just recently and said we're not an academy club, and we aspire to win the Premier League. Finishing fourth's not good enough. So is it as black and white as that? Is it we're an academy club? You could tie in Southampton with that, and the players that they bring through, and the chances they give to small bone and players coming through, or are we're a Premier League winning club or challenging for the Premier League? Can you have an academy club that challenges, or not? Or does that not exist anymore?
Oh yeah, it shouldn't be that clear cut, and it's going to change. You brought on the Barca example, and with Pep at that time, he was not established. He was trying to find his way. That was kind of his second, I think, team that he'd worked with. I think he was with Barcelona B before that, right? But since then, obviously in the last year, it was one of their first matches in a decade where they hadn't started an academy player. And you look at all the managers, the turnover that's occurred, and obviously there's been some good and some bad, crisis that's gone on there. But when you are always coming in, kind of like with United, you're always bringing in someone that is being asked to produce immediately. The natural instinct, the natural reaction is, okay, then I must play the established player that I know can win, not give an opportunity. And so Barca's in that, okay, well, I've got to win immediately. Those are the expectations. And so it comes from the club being able to give the confidence in the manager. It takes the manager to be so not only confident in the players, but confident in themselves and the staff, that they're they're gonna win. They're gonna find ways, or the long term is gonna be with development and winning together. And the longer we go, where so much is at stake after each match, the more that we see that managers are leaving, every 1 and 2 years, or even shorter, like you said with DeBoer. Like the use of academy players is going to be far and few between. We're going to have less of those, and so is it the managers? No, it's the system. All of it kind of plays into it. Is it as simple as saying this is who we are and we're gonna do it? Well, you might be able to do that with Ajax when the competition isn't as great in the Eredivisie, and no disrespect to any of the Dutch sides in that statement, but it isn't. And so maybe you can get away similarly to Sir Alex in the 90s when he was playing his kids. So yeah, it's it doesn't sound promising, but it will take strong wills from both the players and the club and the manager to be able to accomplish that again.
Yeah. And with the examples that we've used so far, so Manchester United, I think Ferguson started at United in '86, so he was there for 9 years before he won that league with academy players. Then Guardiola was actually a product himself through Barcelona, as you say, managed the B team and then managed the first team. So there's almost an affiliation. There's probably a lot of inside information or knowledge about what the academy is producing, the players. There may be a relationship there already. There's certainly a sense of trust and identity around them, so perhaps they're more inclined to use these players and put them in the squad. Whereas if you're a manager that gets parachuted in, so probably the classic example is Mourinho, tends to come into a club with the expectation of he's going to come in and win us a trophy. Not necessarily have a philosophy, but he's a winning manager, he knows how to win. So maybe it takes, there's so many probably variables to all of this. Like you say, you need the club, you need the culture and identity, you need some of the sort of geographical conditions, a bit like Bilbao with their imposed Basque restrictions, but you probably need to have a feel and affiliation with the club as well to be able to put those players in. And perhaps because you've got an affiliation or a relationship with the club, the fans are more willing to give you time to put these players in.
That's a good point.
So yeah, I think if we think about the ones that we've used so far, Manchester United, Ferguson was there for 9 years, Guardiola's come through the club. Van Gaal, not sure how long he was at Ajax prior to winning. I think he was probably there for 6 years. That was towards the end of his tenure. I think he came in about sort of the early 90s. So probably 5-6 years of being at the club. So again, there's a history or a bit of a backstory as to their relationship with those players and the club. And maybe we don't have that anymore. If you look at the average tenure of a Premier League manager now, it's 18 months, if not less.
Yeah, and then we add in, we've stayed away from the Man City and the Phil Foden discussion. That obviously we got Jadon Sancho that is a prime example. We loud Pep saying what a great job he did with Barca. And now we see him. Obviously, he went to Bayern, and we look at what Man City's turned into, and he's got Eric Martinez is at the center back, the Spanish boy that's going to go back. Garcia, that's right. He's going back to, or said he's going to go back to Barca after being in the academy, because obviously he wasn't getting those minutes. And then we've got Phil Foden that is obviously as talented as can be, but David Silva was there, so he put in that preference of David Silva over Phil Foden. There's the immediate. he had his own pressures. You can talk about, we can speculate what the owners of Man City were wanting to achieve and their expectations, but he wanted to, not obviously he could win a Premier League, but it was the Champions League he was searching for, and he put that above. Clearly, he didn't feel that Phil was ready at the time and wanted to wait till David Silva left, and at the expense lost Jadon Sancho, which could be a kind of like when Pogba left United, because Paul Scholes needed to come back out of retirement to help Fergie for that final year, and so you have to bring him back £90 million later to do that, and Jadon Sancho might be that same case.
Yeah, I think probably the ideal scenario would be to, a lot of these, it's 23-man squads. So there's players within that squad that aren't the Galacticos, they aren't the top players, and it's probably moving some of those players out that are probably the next level down without sacrificing the younger players. So if we use the example of Liverpool, in their squad, Shaqiri doesn't play very often. Obviously a very, very good player, an established international, but he's probably on big wages, and his market value is probably not at its peak because of his age and other circumstances. He hasn't played in regularly for a period of time, so a club's probably not going to pay the money that they might get for Brewster, because Brewster's young, he's a hot prospect, his salary's probably significantly less. So Liverpool, the market value between the two players, Brewster probably holds a lot more value than Shaqiri. But if you're thinking from trying to develop homegrown players and bed them into the parent club, the ideal scenario would be probably to sell a squad player such as Shaqiri and keep Brewster, develop him, allow him to play alongside the likes of Firmino, Salah, Mane, and then in time embed him into your own team rather than having to sell him on to fund the likes of Jota coming in, for example. But as I said, there's reasons why that's not happening, and that might be due to the age of a player, it might be the salary that they hold, it might be certain conditions that don't allow them to. So the young player is the easy one to get out. It's the more marketable, especially now with the models like Dortmund, and more clubs I think in France are starting to take that approach. I think clubs in Holland are starting to take that approach, where they know there is a market to be exploited there with young English players that aren't going to get chances. They're going to get frustrated. Let's go and take them and put them in the team, and then if they do well, we can make a lot of money out of them in a couple of years' time.
Yeah, that idea is it's counterintuitive to me. It doesn't make sense in the financial one between Shaqiri and Brewster, because I totally agree with you. Shaqiri makes way more sense for someone. If we were playing Football Manager and we're in this dilemma, who would you put on the transfer? And over the long term, his weekly wages definitely outweigh the immediate transfer fee between the two, and you don't want to let go of one of your potential stars. You look at someone like Adam Lallana. Okay, he left his contract to not resign, so now he's down at Brighton. So that he was thinking for himself. He's I think 29 now, getting on. Obviously won a bunch of medals, but you'd think Shaqiri would be doing that too. But from a club standpoint, the weekly wages makes more sense. This one is a strange one that I definitely agree with you. This homegrown talent needs to stay. Our first team clubs need to find ways to create the space for them to develop. Otherwise, obviously they're going to go off and do those things. So it's a shame that that's occurring to Liverpool, but they're not the only example.
No. I think they're probably one of many now, aren't they? The academy isn't necessarily for the parent club. The academy is now a money-making sort of a business, if you like. If one or two come through, so Alexander-Arnold comes through, then brilliant. he's going to be in that team for many years and probably a future captain of the club. But he's probably the exception as opposed to the rule. So for every Trent that comes through, there's probably 7, 8, 9, 10 players that don't quite make the grade, but then are sold, or there's a loan fee that enables the academy to keep running with the income that comes in, and also then go and buy players that can come in and get instant success, or at least sort of support the team striving for instant success.
Yeah, that model is the Chelsea model, and I remember as being the Palace fan, Simon Jordan a few years back when he was chairman got so fed up with the tribunal when John Bostic was bought by, I think it was Spurs at the time. I think Spurs bought him, but they weren't paid the amount that they had invested in and his value. And that Chelsea model that's obviously changed how many you can loan out, because Chelsea said, you know what, only one of those Trent Alexander is going to be able to come through, so let's go buy 10 of them and stick them in our academy and send them out to loan, and we'll find out who can come through. We only have one spot, but we're going to kind of take the ownership of as many players as possible, and it's a method. It might not be, it makes sense for the academy or for the club. It may not make the most sense for the individuals, which obviously there's going to be those ramifications, and obviously there's changes to rules to prevent people from doing that anymore. But still, we think of it as this loan system is the safety net, when it may not be. In fact, it may be hindering players from really. Do we have too many players that are going out on loan with these expectations that they'll eventually get there? So,
I was sort of seeing some stockpiling of players, sort of getting the best young, talented players, and then almost just keeping them. And if you've got a big pool of players, then the chances are it's the numbers game, isn't it? You might get one or two that come through, and if you can't, then at least we can get some loan fees, or we might get a sell on out of it. So it's an interesting discussion, but hopefully one day we'll see an Ajax or a Barcelona or a Man United winning on the big stage. I think there was maybe one or two in the Bayern team that won the Champions League recently, and again, a team that produces players. They do produce players, but they probably they buy in players at 14 and 15, some of the best in the nation, because they're Bayern Munich and they can do that. But how many then become established first team players because they are a super club? If they weren't in that sort of arena of clubs, then probably a lot of those players would get a chance. If they were a mid-table team or just outside the European places, then those players would probably play week in, week out. But I think that's the cost or the premium when you are a super club. Opportunity, or at least the amount of pressure that prevents you from providing opportunity is certainly a factor. And whether we'll ever see that again, with the game getting bigger and bigger, the global interest, who knows if we'll see that again.
Yeah. Great discussion. Alan Hansen may not have been revered by saying that at the time, but it is certainly a great discussion to find out 25 years later how far off he is, and was he actually forecasting the future.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for joining the conversation. If any of this has sparked an interest in you, check out the resources in the description below to find out more. May the myths be dispelled and the truth stick.